This is part 2 of the missing context of the New Testament. If you're not aware there's a part 1, go back into our episodes and make sure you listen to that one, because we're going to build on what we set down in part 1. In part 1, we learned how the generation before the compilation of the Mishnah found themselves without clarity on some key issues that faced the communities. Of particular concern at the meeting on Adar 9 was how the Jewish people were to navigate interactions with their pagan neighbors, and the various degrees of impurity that were associated. We also learned that the predominant stance at the time was increased separation between Jews and Gentiles. As part of the greater Jewish community, the apostolic leaders struggled with these particular issues more acutely. The sudden influx of Gentiles leaving paganism to join the diasporic Jewish communities made this a primary issue for them, and particularly Paul, one that threatened to divide the community if not resolved. To convert or not? The question the apostolic communities needed to resolve was, did the Gentiles need to convert to Judaism? If not, what was their status and what did that mean in orthopraxic terms? How do they apply this in the day-to-day? Prior to the Jerusalem Council, again around 50 CE, it seems each of these communities handled this problem with some diversity. For example, early on in Galatia, the pressure to convert was very strong. Even Paul himself seemed to have supported this stance at one point. For Jews, circumcision was still a valid part of covenantal obedience, as we saw in Acts 16 when Paul circumcised Timothy, who was a Jew. For some of the Pharisees, conversion seemed to be the best solution. We might recognize this as the position of the school of Shammai. Acts 15:5 tells us, "But some from the religious party of the Pharisees, who had believed, stood up and said, 'It is necessary to circumcise the Gentiles and to order them to observe the law of Moses.'" If you consider the options, though, a formal conversion was the most straightforward solution to the impurity issue. Through this path, the convert was immediately subject to the framework of the Torah, the culmination of thousands of years of wisdom and already established precedents. As discussed in part 1 at that time, the conversion would also instill a degree of separation from the pagan world, so a lot of problems would be solved very simply through this method. The rabbinic process to resolve issues was and is still reliant upon rigorous debate between learned scholars. Similar to the discussion on the 9th of Adar, the apostolic leadership was said to have had a major debate to establish a standard for Gentile inclusion in Jewish communities. They concluded, in Acts 15:19-21, "Therefore I conclude that we should not cause extra difficulty for those among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things defiled by idols, and from sexual immorality, from what has been strangled, and from blood. For Moses has had those who proclaim him in every town from ancient times, because he is read aloud in the synagogue every Sabbath." If you listen to these words, retained in the New Testament, there are 3 essential assumptions. 1, these prohibitions are in addition to the Noahide laws that were likely already incumbent upon Gentile congregants. 2, the setting was to be the synagogue, and or a home-based synagogue or Jewish community. 3, it's assumed that they would continue to attend the weekly Shabbat services where they will learn more. The apostolic ruling in Acts 15 seems to have been established upon the Torah's distinction of a ger toshav, or the resident foreigner. Though there's discussion in the Talmud as to who qualifies as a ger toshav, we can say that they're not Jews, and they're not like most pagans. Some suggest that a ger toshav was a Gentile somewhere in the conversion process, though I personally take the path that they may have been their own category, at least enough to warrant the halakhic discussions in Jewish literature. Hence the Talmudic discussions seem to draw a distinction between them and proselytes. Either way, we can say this. A ger toshav seems to be a Gentile who had attached themselves to the Jewish community to some extent, even willingly taking on the 7 Noahide laws. The core emphasis of the laws assigned to them in the Torah are based on preventing the spread of impurity to the land and to the people of Israel. They were not required to immerse or circumcise themselves in order to commit to this new course of life. On this, Maimonides says in Laws of Forbidden Sexual Acts 14:7, what is meant by a ger toshav? He says, a Gentile who makes a commitment not to worship false deities and to observe the other 6 universal laws commanded to Noah's descendants. He does not circumcise himself or immerse. We accept this commitment, and he is considered one of the pious Gentiles. It's worth noting here that the immersion and circumcision are not part of the equation. And it's also worth considering, in the eyes of disapproving Gentile pagans, these may have been the Judaizers or the sympathizers. And of course, we've written about that in the past as well. So what does this mean for Gentiles in Torah? The apostolic ruling also seems to have added more prohibitions to the Gentile followers than the Noahide laws demanded. Additionally, the requirement of immersion in a mikveh seems to hold them in yet a higher category than a normal ger toshav. Of course, this is very important to recognize. The issue of whether or not to obey the Torah commandments was only a question for Gentiles, never one for Jews. Though Acts 15 expands upon Gentile prohibitions, Jews are never expected to abandon the commandments, nor become lax in their observance. Jesus himself warned his Jewish audience never to even think of such an idea. Though this seems to have been a rumor in Paul's time as well, one that James seeks to set straight. Acts 21, verses 20 through 21 tell us, James is speaking, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are that who have believed, and they're all ardent observers of the Torah. They've been informed about you, though, that you teach all the Jews now living among the Gentiles to abandon Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to the customs." So we can see even in Paul's day there was confusion about this. And of course, as a way to mitigate that confusion, James suggests he pays the temple fees for a few people under a vow, right? As a way to show that Paul is very much still Torah observant. So why prohibitions for Gentiles? Why not give them Torah commandments? The reason is it's generally worse spiritually to violate a Torah prohibition than it is to leave a positive commandment undone. See, transgressing prohibitions often bring impurity upon individuals and the entire community. This is why most of the stipulations for a ger toshav are prohibitions. In my view, the prohibitions of Acts 15 are intended to prevent exposure to highly transmissible degrees of impurity. This is why 3 of the 4 rulings in Acts 15 are food-related, and the 4th one is sexual misconduct, which was common and widespread in the Greco-Roman culture. The language indicates that a person who cannot uphold these will not be permitted to remain in the synagogue community. And this, of course, is an area of question. Many people ask, where is the prohibition against murder, lying, etc.? If they weren't already prohibited by Roman law, the Noahide laws that are assumed to be incumbent upon a Gentile are already in act. Otherwise, all these ethics and laws and the refinement of them would be taught continually over time. Remember, Acts 15 is a bare minimum for Gentile inclusion in the synagogue. So, in modern Hebrew roots, Noahide, or even Messianic Jewish communities, debates circle around which of the positive Torah commandments Gentiles should keep, if not all of them, some opting to take on the full load as Jewish people do. But because many are not familiar with the dynamics of impurity or the halakhic process, little attention is paid to the rationale behind prohibitions. And as far as the Jerusalem Council was concerned, it was the prohibitions and the protection of impurity that they were interested in maintaining. Because again, impurity can disable one's suitability for divine inspiration or Holy Spirit. This may have been the underlying concern the apostles sought to prevent. Given the milieu, the apostles seemed themselves surprised that this was even a possibility. Peter recounts this story multiple times. In Acts 15, 8 through 9, we read, "And God, who knows the heart, has testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. And he made no distinction between them and us, cleansing their hearts by faith." His testimony underscores that it was not the strict observance of mitzvot, nor formal conversion, circumcision, that preceded the attainment of this Holy Spirit in the Gentiles. Therefore, their ruling sought to enable and sustain this phenomenon that had already, and somewhat mysteriously, occurred. You can see his language is centered around purity and cleansing. So in conclusion, what can we learn from this? Actually, a few things. The milieu of the New Testament was considered to be a divisive and challenging time for Israel. This, however, was reorganized and reestablished with an emphasis on unity in the following generation. It can be said that today's Judaism is the descendant of the more inclusive school of Pharisaism under Rabbi Hillel. Though one cannot help but spot the reliance and observance of the school of Shammai among the apostles and even Jesus himself. Nevertheless, anachronistically judging all of Judaism and all of Jews through the filter of the New Testament has been and is still wrought with flaws. Much has changed. Second, in the quest to distance itself from the Torah commandments, Christianity emerged with little to no awareness of the importance of spiritual purity and the methods of protection. If indeed this form of purity is a concern for all people, we would do well to see a reemergence of this and the ethics in the church and messianic communities. In Judaism, this discipline is known as musar, which strengthens and develops one's ethics and refinement of character. Third, the primary innovations and transformation of the New Testament are that Gentiles were apparently receiving divine inspiration through their connection to Jesus. From this observation, most of Paul's teachings seek to clarify how Gentiles might protect and develop this spiritual gift. Though perhaps controversial, for the Jewish people there was little change to their personal day-to-day observances of the Torah and their expectations of faithfulness to God. For a more in-depth reading of these and other topics, consider purchasing the book Eshdot, Rabbi Shaul's Mystical System in the Law. It gives a deeply orthodox view of Paul's language and the problem the Apostolic community was solving for. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this topic. Remember, you can find more information at thehiddenorchard.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share this podcast with your friends. We don't really engage in marketing, so it's word of mouth and references like that really help spread the word. Also, I want to say thank you to those who subscribe to the site and those who support the Hidden Orchard Project financially. Without you, it wouldn't be possible, so thank you. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.